why are you qualified to give this talk? Well, I'm technically not. However, through my pitching journey, I've been very, very, very lucky to get a wide array of So you may be thinking, why are you qualified to be giving this talk? Well, I'm not. But throughout my pitching journey, I think I've probably talked to over 100 different people just getting advice on my deck, on my angles, and how I'm communicating. I was also very, very lucky to be able to be hosted by Bad Robot Studios for a couple of months where they gave me some incredible feedback. So I'm not qualified as a developer, but I have spoken to a lot of different developers on my pitching journey. I talked to developers who are successful, and they've shared some of their advice, resources, pitch decks, as well as any of the discussions that they might have had. So throughout this talk, I'll be showing you a couple of slides from my pitch deck. After this talk, there'll be a resources folder where you'll be able to find links to all of the talks that have helped me. And I'll also put in my pitch deck, so if you need to use one as an example, go ahead. I don't think mine is by any means the best, but I did get extremely lucky in being able to look at other people's. So if you can, try to look at as many different pitch decks as possible. Find as many as you can and decide what works best for you. This talk does assume that you already have got a pitch deck and you just want to customize it for the current state of affairs. There are also things that have been points of feedback and things that have personally worked for me, but they're by no means a necessity. If you're a successful studio working with indie hits in a genre that's known and loved, you're probably going to have a much easier time than working on a debut studio game on a game for teenage girls. So, first topic, you can't polish a turd, but you can roll it in glitter. Now, the first thing to ask yourself is, who is your game for? If you can't answer that, well, don't worry, I've got resources, but for starters, let's pretend you've already figured out who your audience is. Now, if it's a niche, you might find a lot of publishers might not cater to that. For example, my audience is teenage girls. However, I found that not all publishers could cater towards them or even knew how to market to them, or that they even played games. I needed a second audience. One of the things that I found is about Space Princess is it's really inspired by things like Adventure Time, Bee and Puppycat, Steven Universe. All of these things had a second audience of adults. Looking outside of games can be incredibly useful, especially working out consumer behavior and audience taste, but we'll get to that a little later though. One of the best advice that I got from a publisher agent was the fact that you can emphasize either your primary audience or your secondary audience depending on who you're talking to. Because my secondary audience overlaps a lot more with traditional publishers, I had an easier time pitching that overall. I like to think of it like a pie. You kind of want to have a couple of different flavors, but you also don't want to make yourself sick either. If there's no common ground between you and the people that you're pitching to, especially if they're publishers, it's a very easy no. So it's your job to find that common ground. And if it's a publisher, work out how to best use their expertise in helping you bring your game to market. You can show what your audience is with statistics, similar titles, and if you're in an established genre, forecasting. We'll get into how to display statistics and similar titles later on. However, forecasting is a little bit of a too big topic for this talk. However, I have provided some resources that you can use. So, one note that I have had especially is if you're using sources, make sure you know where the sources have come from. A lot of the questions that I get is, where did I get my data from? So it's a good idea to familiar yourself with the statistics as well as where they're coming from. GDC talks and academic articles can be a really, really great way to have sources. I'm also keeping this talk super light on audience and forecasting, but for getting started, Matt's talk is probably a really, really good one to watch. And if you want the most up-to-date knowledge, go to the ones with the star. For forecasting, Clark Tank and the Wings Talk have been really, really good at deep diving into a really complex topic. So probably get started there. Woo woo, all about the gravy train. Now, while we're on the topic of changing our angle, one thing that you can use is looking at trends in bandwagons. Now, I'm not saying to change your game to be like other bandwagons, but it's quite likely that you might have one aspect in common with the media that is trendy. For example, if you're pitching a social party game, it might be worth mentioning Among Us if it's relevant. So I tend to have two different comparisons to my deck. One is influences and the other is similar titles. I find that influences for the game is good to think about a balancing act between audience and tone. For audience, I try to select popular titles that a publisher would know or that share the same audience as me. I also make sure that my titles have secondary audiences. For example, both She-Ra, Steven Universe, and Adventure Time all share the same targeting for kids and teenagers, but also feature adults. I also make sure that I choose the media with the greatest recognition. For example, I could have chosen Owl House instead of She-Ra or Space Dandy instead of Adventure Time. However, Adventure Time and She-Ra just have that little bit more recognition. Think about the reason as to why you're including an influence, and then think about the tone and audience of that media. For example, I purposely included Over the Garden Wall, even though it's not as popular as some other media, just because it's got a darker tone, but still being for kids. I don't want my game to seem too wholesome. So, think about why you're including inspiration, but also think of it as a balancing act between tone and audience. In terms of Space Princess, I think about the influence with 4 pillars. This is a very standard approach, and it's often used for crafting some pitch decks, working out your unique selling points. But for Space Princess, it's magical girls, absurdism, environmental storytelling, and existentialism. I make sure I feature one inspiration from each category, but I can swap out what a title is based on a publisher's perception. For example, Alice in Wonderland and Night in the Woods have got slightly different audiences and tones. Influences should help you convey the tone and audiences. However, similar titles should help you forecast. I've mentioned forecasting, and it's a good exercise to do, even though it does require a bit of maths. So, whoever you're pitching to will likely have some experience at forecasting and working out the viability of a title. So when you're picking titles, try to pick games that have had similar budgets, have come out relatively recently. When I choose my game, I've got them in 3 different categories: titles for forecasting and titles for scope. I've also got a wildcard title that I can swap out depending on who I'm talking to. I use this title to convey some of the tone that I mentioned earlier. When you're talking about forecasting, it's important to take note of the genre. Narrative adventure games tend to do better than point-and-click adventures, and dating sims tend to have a niche but thriving market. It's also, in this time, publishers a lot more risk-averse, so you really need to know what genres are doing well. Once you've got similar games in your genre, it's important to think about audience. Take After Party, Night Schoolers Next Game versus Octonfree. While it's in the same genre, the tone and audience is a little bit different from Space Princesses. I also have titles that reference the scope of the games. Because 2 hours is a very short amount of playtime, I had to make sure I put titles to convey that you can have a successful short game. So take note of what some of the negatives are towards your game and include successful examples. I also have a wildcard title that I like to swap up. If your game is in a clearly defined genre, it's a little easier to find examples. However, because there's not that many young adult narrative games, I like to replace the title with something that represents one of my 4 pillars. This example, for example, would come under existentialism. I also take note of what platforms the publisher likes to push. If they're familiar with Apple Arcade, it's nice to put other arcade titles, as they'll likely be experienced with the process. While I mentioned point-and-click adventures selling far less than narrative adventure games, there's still publishers who cater towards that niche, and I also know wholesome games right now are quite trendy, so I use Broken Age to kind of use it as an example of some of the wholesome aspects of my game, even though it does have some darker tones. I also know some publishers are building up their portfolio and love to have taste games, which are kind of auteur personality games. These are a little bit risky because sales can be completely all over the place, but if a publisher is familiar with this and has published this type of stuff before, it might be an idea to go with this as your wildcard title. Finally, for me, I have the wildcard title. This is for publishers that I'm pitching my secondary audience towards. I like to have a talking point, and because jazz punk very much covers a lot of my pillars, I can kind of use that as a conversation piece. I generally only use this if the publisher has like a very masculine brand. In the pitch sign that I made, I also point out aspects of the titles and have a fair bit of writing, so you can do this if you want to make things crystal clear. Swapping out titles is extremely quick and customizable. It's also a great way to convey audience, genre, scope, and tone, as well as any trends that might be in the market. If you have an established genre, it might also be worth looking at some of the talks on forecasting. Most importantly though, try to pick titles that the publisher knows. I like having a wildcard title just to swap out, just so I can play to their taste. Adapt your pitch to their taste, but the groundwork should be solid enough already. Here's some resources that you can also go into detail about pitch decks and pitching. Universally, the advice is know your market, but this is just one of the many ways that you can show it. So, what happens when you don't know the publisher's taste? Well, first you have to work out where is the publisher coming from. Anyone who started a fund likely isn't hiring people who is inexperienced, so it might be worth knowing where the people are coming from, or like why they're starting up a company. GameIndustry.biz is a really great source for this that you can quickly Google stuff. It's also worth knowing that if they're part of a large company, for example, film studios such as Madison Wells Media or Animal Kingdom or Bad Robot have a larger brand that they represent. Companies like Private Division and Square Enix Collective are indie branch of larger publishers. So if it is in that category, think about what the company's values are. Staff from other publishers can also leave and start up their own studio. But most importantly, find out what the company's values are. Often this is in form of a mission or a promise statement, and one company that I was looking for had the promise statement of personal, emotional, and original. So I made sure that I addressed every single one of those points. This is kind of a cheat sheet, but if they don't have a portfolio, look at their mission statement, work out where they're coming from, what they have worked on, and what did they sign. Try to work out what their taste is, and then apply to their senses. There's always ways to dig. So everyone has come from somewhere. Just work out what their taste and make sure your game overlaps. Now, I know this is a lot, and you don't have to do this for every single publisher, but I find if you do have a dream publisher, this is the amount of depth that you can really go into tailor for them. So one thing that I like to do is if I have an eye on a publisher is to watch a talk by them. They'll likely go into what some of their core values are, and if you're pitching, you can bring up some of their values and how that applies to your game. So here's some of the talks that I've seen as examples. Now, I've mentioned having multiple pitch decks and tailoring your pitch decks to people, but there's also multiple budgets, which can be really hard to keep track of. So I have a lot of my minor changes that I do, but the budget is the most difficult to keep track of. So I have, in terms of all my changes, it's budget, scope, platforms, and make sure when you're choosing a platform, the publisher has already catered towards this platform before. Don't just pitch to one platform if the publisher hasn't catered towards it. audience, and similar titles. And this is kind of the weight of the importance. You don't want to be pitching the wrong publisher. However, your budget is going to be likely changing if you're pitching to an investor versus a publisher. I find when you're pitching, it's important to know the 3 different types of budget. You've got platform, investor, and publisher. The way that I've found it easiest for me is to have two numbers, a dream budget within reason and a basic product. Ideally, you want to be pitching your dream budget, but it's important to know what your minimum good game budget is. The publisher is likely going to be the cheapest, as you don't need to put money for porting or localization, but you do need to cover yourself for development costs. My premium budget and basic budget depends on who I'm talking to. For example, $250,000 is my premium budget, is barely anything for some, but it is a lot to others. So if you're focusing on investors, make sure that you leave some room for marketing. It's a huge red flag if you don't do this, and if you've got someone else doing your marketing, you do need to state this. So make sure if you have got the game's release funding for Film Victoria, make sure you've put that down and any other in-kind marketing that you are doing. QA is another important thing that you need to put down, especially if you're looking for an investor. And there's also other operation costs, but I won't go into too much detail. But I will link a thread later on what Callum from Kowloon expects. Finally, there's little things like localization. These things are optional, but it's a good idea to know how they work. For example, it's worth knowing how many words your game has. For example, mine has 25,000 words, but it's also complex to translate because of the pun-based humor. Platforms also want to know what the whole budget for the game is. It's very unlikely that they'll give you that whole budget, but they will give you some money to entice you for an exclusive for that platform. They want to know the budget of the game overall, as that helps them forecast. If you're targeting next gen, it's important to know what features they're going to be pushing, so try to work out how much it costs for the features and what they want to hit. This could be, for example, 4K at 60 frames per second, or making use of their special piece of hardware or controller. It's also worth noting that you probably don't want to be targeting next gen on a basic budget. Here are some very rough figures that I've estimated for myself. Again, these are incredibly rough, so take this with a grain of salt. However, when putting together budgets, it's much easier to take note of how much each module costs, so you can very quickly customize a budget for whoever you're pitching to. For an investor, you don't have to pitch every component, but you will get questions on how much something is, so make sure you know your numbers and why they are the way they are. A question will likely be, how did you calculate this? For a publisher, they just need to know the cost of the game. Do your research, however, and make sure you know exactly what they're offering. Some publishers just specialize in marketing, so you need to know what they offer. They'll ask questions like, what engine are you using? How long do things take? How many words you have? So just have answers to any of the questions. Platforms also like to know timeframes. Generally, they realize that things are going to be hard to give exact dates, but closer to the launch, it's good to work with them to figure out a time frame and when you can launch. It's also a really good idea to know what you can trade them, for example, exclusivity or version exclusive content. So just know that it's more of a trade. You might need to know exact numbers, but you do need to know what gets calculated. Just a couple of examples. This is an example budget that I made for a platform versus a smaller investor. And know why your figures are the way you are. Know how much investors vest. Wings is fantastic, but it does, however, have a much lower budget than, say, Kowloon Knights. So know what their sweet spot is. Sometimes you want to be a little bit extra. So this is what my pitch scene looks like. It's got a bunch of pages that I kind of made in my game style, and it goes into a lot more information. The most important thing is that I'm able to tell jokes and really personalize it. This one's for a platform. One strength that I knew I had was I knew a little bit about graphic design, and for me, it was super easy to whip up. Other people have done twines, weird vertical slices, or other media. So think about a way to make you stand out if the odds are stacked against you. So, for example, this is my overview. I'm a little bit cheeky, I can make jokes, I can really go in and show the personality of my game. I can also put some, I don't really have splash art, but I can be a total trash lord and make a personalized cover by just embedding jokes in it. I also make sure I have the correct budget, platforms, and I can go into a little bit of detail about the themes of my game, which I couldn't really do with my pitch deck. This is really important as it's a way for me to explain how my game subverts its genre, and it's also important in the narrative for teenage girls. This is largely similar to the pitch deck, but it is a little bit more readable. So this is the same, but influences, I went into a lot greater detail, especially about the 4 pillars, and I was really able to explain the tone of my game and why I chose some of the titles. This is the same as the pitch deck, however, I go into a little bit more detail about the audience and really try and break down some of those internal biases. This is probably my weakest page as my budget isn't that clear. I also want to point out, just don't put dates. Just put month 1, month 2, month 3. I also explained my game scope. You can I'm very casual in my tone. I find that just having a scope page as well as a game design macro is really, really good because it lets you easily talk about the scope of your game and how much you've done in a really easy visual manner. Finally, on the last page, I like to make an emotional case. I like to use of what we talked about in the meeting, include pieces there. This is similar to the design philosophy, but there's more of a overlap between them or me. Or I just make dumb jokes. Either way, it's a way to kind of call to action. Ideally, this should support your pitch deck. You can use supporting materials to show details that you couldn't do. And if a company does due diligence, these materials are the ones that are going to be the most useful, especially if they're looking at your game without you being there. Now that I have it all built out, it's incredibly easy just to swap different pages depending on who I'm talking to. I'll absolutely talk to other developers, find out how the publisher works, and then customize it. Or if I don't know anyone who works with them, usually after the meeting, I will make my pitch scene based on that. Basically, I'm making sure if I do have an internal champion, I want to make their job as easy as possible. All else fails, get into their heads. So I don't really have a lot of time to go into this, but one tip is just read this book. I read it about 10 years ago, and every time I have to do a marketing document, it's been a walk in the park. It's mostly about communication, so if you have one takeaway, it is this book. But here are the marketing philosophies in a nutshell. You're dealing with negative time, you have to be efficient with your information, tone of voice, and 3, tone of voice, colors, fonts, all have to enhance. This is just kind of some of the changes that I've found for pitch decks that have been easy to implement. Publishers, for example, have been a lot more cautious. You really want to get those face-to-face meetings, and I've found that I've had to kind of try a lot harder in order to get some of those meetings rather than at GDC where you can kind of just like waltz up and just be like, hi. So one thing that I have done is for all of the networking and production resources, I've uploaded it in this link right here. And you can find all of the notes and talks and things that I've found really useful and hopefully point you in the right direction. Definitely one of the things that you should absolutely check out is Guy runs this thing called The Gig. Absolutely check that out. And another resource for when you're pitching is to join the Discord, and as well as information on the Pitch Your Game, which I've linked earlier. And I've just got a couple of notes that I found from Meet to Match, which are pretty self-explanatory, but good luck with everything.